That is Prime Minister Mark Carney just a few moments ago speaking virtually at the BMO Eurasia Summit in Toronto. He's being interviewed actually by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's former Principal Secretary, Gerry Butts. That's really the only kind of news out of what he said, that he expects there are some bilateral deals on the side, as we would kind of anticipate given the sectoral tariffs that exist. But other than that, it'll all fall to CUSMA. The Prime Minister has just returned from meeting U.S. President Donald Trump. The meeting ended on friendly, positive vibes, but fell short of any concrete announcement. Does that matter politically for the Prime Minister? Let's bring in our front bench. Sharon Carr is a CTV News political analyst. She's the former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau. Kevin Deagle is a Vice President at Crestview Strategy. He held senior roles in key portfolios in the Trudeau government, including at Natural Resources Canada. Jamie Ellerton, next to him, is the Principal at Canaptus and worked for Minister Jason Kenney during the Harper government. And Sebastian Skamsky was former Director of Media Relations to Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you. Okay, Sharon, I'm going to start with you. The back and forth in the House was really wild today. It was definitely the best exchanges I've seen since the House returned. There is a ton of pressure from the opposition on the Prime Minister to come back with something tangible. That didn't occur. Does it matter politically for him?
I think it's going to matter to a certain extent, but I think what everyone needs to remember is that this is not a normal negotiation. This is not normal diplomacy. We are dealing with Donald Trump. President Donald Trump is not a normal politician. Everything to him has to be done in a certain measured way. Do I think that the meeting in the U.S. was not successful? Absolutely not. I think tone and tenor is a big part of how that interaction happens, and we saw that the reaction and the conversations were pleasant, they were friendly, and they were not adversarial as we've seen in the past with Prime Minister Trudeau. Now, there's been a lot of talk about what's going to be give and take, and we just had Andrew Scheer on the show talking about Keystone XL, and I think that it's an interesting one to have President Trump raise Keystone XL. I got to push back on some of the commentary and the conversation he just had with you, Vashi, because sitting in a really interesting position here, having actually worked for TC Energy, crisscrossing Canada and the U.S., trying to get Keystone and Energy East built. It was the Harper government that we were kind of having to deal with, trying to get everything done, and it was the Harper government where we weren't able to get it done. And I think that his argument that the Liberal government has not done anything for the energy sector, I think is a bit of a revisionist history. The government did get TMX. I worked for the minister when we got TMX. I think it's not, we live in an environment
Save
that was...
the pipeline stuff for the second part of our discussion.
Fine. But what I will say is that from a win perspective for Prime Minister Carney, I will say from my perspective, having seen and been part of the first round of negotiations with Trump and his administration, I actually think it was a success in the sense that they didn't come out with anything catastrophic. People, though, politically are going to want to see little tidbits, but I think part of the negotiating strategy is not to be negotiating in public the way they have in the past.
Right. Jamie, I think Sharon hits at the key question, which is 6 months ago when we all breathed a collective sigh of relief at the degree to which there was, mutual respect shown between the Prime Minister and the President. That was then, right? Like, that seemed like a win to escape unscathed. Can the same lens be applied here all of these months later when, in the interim, to be fair, like, the Prime Minister did set out deadlines for himself and for his government that, they didn't end up meeting?
Yeah, actually, I think I would say two things to that. One, I don't think it's going to have massive political consequences for him, because when you look at public opinion polls, Canadians still overwhelmingly trust Prime Minister Carney to be the best person to deal with President Trump. And where Prime Minister Carney, is slipping in public opinion polls and having real challenges, it's on the domestic front and his lack of action in being able to get stuff done here back at home. And so on that front, I think is where he's going to continue to face more of an Achilles heel. I think Canadians generally are smart. And when you hear the opposition say, you don't have a deal, like a lot of other countries don't have a deal, and when he talks about the fact that USMCA and our tariffs are lower than other jurisdictions, those are things that I think are ultimately going to resonate with the average Canadian. They're going to rally themselves and wrap themselves in the flag and agree and say why they don't like Donald Trump. I don't actually think Prime Minister Carney, at this juncture, pays the political price for it.
I'm going to move right over to your side to Kevin, who is nodding voraciously. I would guess that he agrees with you. I know Seb will probably have a different view. Kevin, what do you think?
Yeah, I really do agree with this. I think that Prime Minister Carney took a risk in going down to the Oval Office because we know what we would expect coming back without a deal. We expect the furor that we saw in the House of Commons today, and I give Mr. Poilievre a lot of credit. He's very good in his role as opposition leader and he's doing his best to stay relevant. But what I wanted to see come out of this was to see Prime Minister Carney investing in the relationship, building trust on a bilateral degree with President Trump, which is what we saw. And that is a fundamental basis for us to move forwards, seek the concessions that we're looking to get, move forwards on the trade agreements that we're negotiating, and have that relationship be strong, be built on trust. And I think that's what we saw come out of the Oval Office.
Sebastian, your thoughts?
Well, I have to give, again, great credit to Prime Minister Carney for being so predictable. I think we did see him at his finest. He has gone down to yet another country, this time the United States, with returning really with not a lot, in fact, nothing, probably even worse than nothing. He has returned with the promise to America to invest $1 trillion into that country, which is staggering when you consider that in the last 6 months of his tenure as Prime Minister, Canada, the country which he governs, has lost $52 billion of investment, and I believe is 87,000 jobs. So the bar was set very low. It was actually non-existent, and he somehow managed to actually do the opposite of what we as Canadians had elected him to do. And it is, I think, begs the question, what is actually going on with these negotiations? He has set two deadlines for himself, both which have been missed. There has been, every concession has been made on behalf of Canada, with nothing in return from the state. So I'm really waiting and hoping to see some positive movement from Prime Minister Carney for the sake of Canada in the coming weeks and months.
I do want to circle back to Sharon and Jamie's point around the pipeline and the domestic aspect to this, because against the backdrop of what we just talked about with the United States, there's a lot of messaging from the government about, finding new markets, diversifying, all that kind of stuff. So we've got this pitch, Sharon, from Alberta's Premier. We had Premier Eby on to respond tonight. He is having none of it. It seems like, just like last week, it continues to be an even bigger political headache now for the federal government. Both parties are looking squarely at the Prime Minister to make a call. How much of a political vulnerability for him is that, potentially?
It can be a vulnerability, but I think what we see here is a time where we need the Prime Minister to kind of step up and say, we've got to all hold hands and sing Kumbaya again. We saw a moment of time where we finally had this period where there was this protectionist, Canadian protectionist nationalism, where Donald Trump kind of made all the provinces say, you know what, we got to work together. We even heard Quebec not too long ago, Premier Legault say, social license might change and we might be able to do a pipeline through Quebec. We've seen this song and dance before, and I actually, in watching Premier Eby's commentary before this, I got to say, I don't think he is going to be winning any public relation battles when it comes to Canada as a whole here, because we can't stand up and say we got to fight Trump, and then immediately the second that Alberta wants to take product out to market, put our hands up and say, no, we've got to consult with this group. Of course, consultation needs to happen, but we are our own worst enemies if premiers are going to put their hands up and say, not through my backyard. And I got to say, I'm, as a Liberal who is extremely pro-energy sector, have worked on TMX, have worked on Energy East, have worked on Keystone, we are letting the opposition win a narrative when we actually have this inner fighting here. So I got to give Premier Smith credit, because she has said, you know what, we can't get proponents because proponents don't want to sink money into projects. And she said, you know what, we'll put in the $15 million, find more. Let's call the government's bluff. And the federal government has to look at it as a major project. And I think Premier Eby has to look at this then more than his provincial politics.
We haven't seen yet evidence, though, from, for example, the new energy minister, Tim Hodgson, Jamie, that he's willing to kind of stake a claim. He's like, well, they'll go through the process. They'll be like any other proponent.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason for that is because clearly the private sector has viewed Canadian government policy as too onerous to make it worthwhile to put their investment dollars into the country, which is why you do see the province of Alberta putting forth taxpayers' dollars to essentially seed the prospect of a project that was otherwise economical 10 years ago. And the only reason it's not today is because of government policy. I think when you look at the realities of the politics of this, we know Mark Carney's voter coalition is center-left left and a bit of the center right, and has an impossible balancing act as to how he's going to do that. And so how he sequences this fight and how he sequences the decision, he ultimately can't come down as looking like he's picking a side and having a clear winner and loser. He's going to have to create conditions, politically speaking, that gives Premier Eby somewhat of an off-ramp and enough of a timeline to neutralize, like you talked in your own interview with Premier Eby, that he faces a review vote. So maybe real movement on this isn't going to come until after that to allow him an off-ramp to save some face. And I think the politics of this are going to be what continues to be acrimonious. The Conservatives get to talk about how they're going to support this. They're right in that the federal government is responsible for these things, and that's where federal leadership can be. I think they're obviously talking to their political base predominantly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, as well as Canadians more broadly who, frankly, voted for Mark Carney thinking that we could work together as Canadians with our elbows up to push back what the Americans are doing. But the politics on this are going to continue to be quite fraught, and I don't envy Mark Carney having to navigate this, because I do think his whole premiership will sink or swim on it.
I have just a few minutes. I want to split it evenly between Kevin and Sebastian. Kevin, you worked on a bunch of these files, in particular at NRCan. Do you think there is a politically palatable solution the Prime Minister could offer?
You know, I always take a second to zoom out a little bit. And to me, what this seems like at this point is far more of a political play than an economic one. Let's put $14 million into perspective. To get a pipeline like this done, it's not even enough to do the basic planning possible. And so this is, when I look at these ideas and projects, we look for a proponent, we look for the business case, but we don't have either of those at this point. We don't know what the route will be. We don't know what the Indigenous communities and partners will be. There's still so many question marks at this stage that I think before we get too far down this road, we need to start considering what is the actual business case here, what proponents will be stepping up, how real is this really? And keep in mind that both of these premiers are facing a bit of political pressure at home. Danielle Smith with the teachers' strike, and Premier Eby with potential rumblings of their political fortunes in the province. And so I think they're both happy to have an intense fight like this, but I always try to go back to the fundamentals of the private sector proponents and so on.
Last 30 seconds to you, Seb.
I mean, it's perplexing. I think I listened to the same interview that you gave, or you had with Mr. Eby, and it was really confounding. I don't understand what the purpose of hurting your own country is, your own province. Every one of his arguments seemed conflicting with reality. And so I really do hope that common sense prevails, not to overuse that term. And like Sharon has said, we actually come together to get our resources to water, to export. Like, we cannot do this any other way if not through our ports. And so for whatever reasons, political or otherwise, I wish Mr. Eby well in his leadership review. If that's what it takes, and afterwards he can come and have some common sense to support this, I hope that happens. Until then, really cheering on Premier Smith and her efforts here, because the feds really got to get out of the way, and we got to get this pipeline built.
I got to leave it on that note. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Sebastian Skamsky, Kevin Deagle, Jamie Allerton, and Sharon Carr, our front bench.